Why did kings always say they ruled by divine right? Not by competence, not by election, not by merit, by blood, and by divine right. For millennia, this idea was accepted as absolute truth. The king rules because God chose that lineage, period. But there's a question nobody asked. Why would God choose one specific family and not another? The official answer is divine mystery. It's not for humans to question, but there's another answer, older, more concrete, an answer engraved in clay, in a 5,000-year-old document that lists the rulers of humanity from the very beginning of time. And that list begins with a detail that official history prefers to treat as myth. The first kings were not human, and the kings who came after them were not completely human either. They were carriers of a lineage, a specific genetic heritage passed from generation to generation, with a care that today we would call power engineering. The Anunnaki never left. They simply traded golden crowns for crowns of blood. Today you're going to see how this lineage began in Sumer, how it was preserved through carefully controlled marriages, what symbols its carriers used to recognize each other, and how the Merovingians became the most documented link between the ancient gods and the families that ruled Europe for centuries. Stay until the end, because in the next episode, we're going to show you where this lineage is today, and the answer will surprise you. In 1906, archaeologists excavating in present-day Iraq found a clay tablet. It was taken to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it remains to this day. And what was written on it disturbed scholars from the very first day. It was a list, a king list, with the names of each ruler, the city where they reigned, and how long they held power, the Sumerian King List. And it begins with a sentence that no modern historical document would dare to write: when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Kingship descended from heaven. It didn't arise among humans. It wasn't invented by wise men. It wasn't won in battle. It descended from heaven. This sentence is not poetic. It's not a religious metaphor. It's in an administrative document, the same kind the Sumerians used to record harvests, taxes, and commercial transactions. The Sumerians were recording a historical fact as they understood it, and the facts that follow are even more disturbing. The impossible reigns. The first kings on the list have reign lengths that modern archaeology immediately categorizes as mythological. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, 800 years of reign. Al-Algar, the second king, 36,000 years. Enmen-Luana, 43,200 years. The first 8 kings together ruled for more than 240,000 years. The conventional answer is simple: ritual exaggeration. The Sumerians inflated numbers to express divine greatness. But this explanation has a problem. The Sumerians were extraordinarily precise in their other records. We know grain prices in Ur from 4,000 years ago. We know wages of workers building temples. We know commercial transactions in detail that would embarrass a modern accountant. People that meticulous didn't randomly inflate historical numbers. And there's another possibility that alternative researchers propose. Zechariah Sitchin, the scholar who spent decades translating Sumerian texts, calculated that Nibiru, the Anunnaki planet, has an orbit of approximately 3,600 Earth years. For beings from Nibiru, time is measured in an entirely different way. 1 year of Nibiru equals 3,600 Earth years. If the reigns on the king list were recorded in Nibiru years and later poorly converted to Earth years, the numbers make sense. 28,800 Earth years divided by 3,600 gives 8 Nibiru years. 8 years of reign for the first king, a reasonable period. 36,000 Earth years divided by 3,600 gives 10 Nibiru years. The impossible numbers become plausible when you change the measuring system. The flood as turning point. The king list continues, and at a certain point, it says something fundamental. Then the flood swept over everything. After the flood, when kingship had descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. 2 things are extraordinary about this sentence. First, the flood is treated as a documented historical event, not as a religious metaphor, as a fact that interrupted a sequence of rulers. Second, After the flood, kingship didn't arise spontaneously among the human survivors. It was reinstated deliberately. From above, kingship descended from heaven again, and the kings who appear after the flood have much shorter reign lengths, hundreds of years, not tens of thousands, as if the lineage was diluting with each generation, losing potency, losing longevity, becoming increasingly human, but never completely losing what made it special, the right to rule, the legitimacy that came from blood. In Sumerian texts, there is a concept that most academics translate as kingship or royal institution, Nam Lugal. In Sumerian, it literally means the essence of kingship. But what the texts reveal about the Nam Lugal is far more specific than a political institution. The Nam Lugal was not an abstract idea, not a position someone held through competence or conquest. It was something physical, something transmissible, something that could be passed from father to son, or lost if the lineage was contaminated with inadequate blood. The Sumerian texts speak of the Nam Lugal as if it were a substance, a quality that existed in certain people and not others. That could be strengthened by certain marriages and diluted by others, and there's a detail in the texts that researchers rarely highlight. When a king lost power, when his city was conquered, the texts don't say he lost his army, or his treasury, or his territory. They say he lost the Nam Lugal. The essence of kingship went elsewhere, to another city, to another carrier, as if the legitimacy of power wasn't geographic, wasn't military, was genetic, and could move with the right person. The preservation system. The Anunnaki who remained on Earth after the Great Departure, or who worked through representatives, had a direct interest in controlling who married whom, because controlled marriage meant controlled lineage, and controlled lineage meant power guaranteed for generations. The pattern repeats across all great ancient civilizations with a consistency that cannot be coincidence. In Egypt, pharaohs frequently married sisters or close cousins. Official history explains this as an attempt to keep wealth within the royal family. But the Egyptian texts say something different. Marriage within the royal lineage was necessary to preserve the blood of Horus, the divine blood that legitimized rulership. It wasn't financial strategy, it was genetic obligation. In Sumer, kings frequently declared in inscriptions that they were chosen by the divine womb, or that their blood had been purified by the gods. In Mesopotamia, marriage alliances between city-states were as important as military alliances, because joining two lineages that carried Anunnaki heritage traits produced descendants with those characteristics amplified. It was genetic engineering. Done through carefully planned marriages over centuries, Alexander and the logic of blood. There's a historical example that perfectly illustrates this system, and that is rarely interpreted this way. Alexander the Great, when he conquered Persia, did something his generals didn't fully understand. He married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, and then Statira, daughter of Darius himself, the Persian emperor he had defeated in battle. Why would a conqueror marry the daughter of the man he'd defeated? The conventional explanation: politics, legitimacy before conquered peoples. But there's another reading, one that makes much more sense in light of what we've seen. Alexander knew, or deeply intuited, that he needed their blood to legitimize his rule in a way no military victory could guarantee alone. He needed the Persian Nam Lugal, and the only way to obtain it was through the lineage of Darius's daughters. The most powerful conqueror of the ancient world submitted to the same system that Sumerian scribes had documented 2,000 years earlier. Lineage wasn't an ornament of power, it was the foundation of power. If the lineage was preserved through controlled marriages, there was a practical problem. How did lineage carriers recognize each other? How did a family in Rome know that a family in Carthage shared the same origin? How did a medieval king in France identify a potential ally in a king in Hungary? The answer is symbols, specific marks that lineage carriers used for millennia, that crossed empires and civilizations, that are still present today, for those who know where to look. The serpent and the dragon. There is one symbol that appears in every culture linked to the Anunnaki lineage, from Sumer to Egypt, from Egypt to Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to medieval Europe, the serpent, and its more imposing version, the dragon. In Sumer, Enki, the Anunnaki responsible for creating and modifying humanity, was represented by two serpents intertwined around a staff. This symbol still exists today. You know it as the caduceus, the symbol of medicine. Two reptiles spiraling around a central staff. For the Sumerians, this symbol didn't represent medicine. It represented Enki's genetic knowledge, the power to manipulate life, the wisdom of one who had created humanity through modification of primate DNA. In Egypt, the serpent appears on the pharaoh's crown, the uraeus, the royal cobra, raised on the ruler's forehead. It wasn't decoration, it was a declaration. I carry the blood of those who brought knowledge. I am a carrier of the lineage. In Greece, noble families traced their origin to heroes with divine blood, and many of those heroes had explicit connections to serpents. Cadmus, the mythical founder of Thebes, killed a sacred serpent and planted its teeth in the soil, from which warriors sprang. The very city of Thebes was born from a serpent. Asclepius, the god of medicine, son of Apollo, carried a staff with a single coiled serpent, the same symbol in simplified form as Enki's caduceus. The Order of the Dragon. In medieval Europe, the dragon symbol becomes more explicit as a lineage marker. In 1408, King Sigismund of Hungary created the Order of the Dragon, an order of knights whose symbol was a dragon coiled upon itself, biting its own tail. Members were kings and nobles from Europe's most powerful families. The father of Vlad, the historical figure who inspired Dracula, was a member of this order. That's why his son became known as Dracul, son of the dragon in Romanian. But long before the medieval Order of the Dragon, the symbol was already in the coats of arms of European royal families. Wales, a red dragon as the national symbol. Dozens of noble families with serpents or dragons on their heraldic coats of arms. This is not decorative coincidence, it's a pattern. Families spread across different continents and centuries, all using the same symbol because they shared the same understanding of their origin, the fleur-de-lis. But the most revealing symbol is one that most people recognize without knowing what it means. The fleur-de-lis, 3 petals in a stylized form, the symbol of French royalty for more than 1,000 years. Researchers studying ancient iconography have identified that the fleur-de-lis is visually identical to a symbol appearing in Sumerian reliefs dating to more than 3,000 years before Christ. A symbol associated specifically with divine kingship, with the Nam Lugal, with the essence of legitimate power that came from the gods. How did the same specific symbol leap from Sumer of 3000 BC to France in the 5th century AD? Through an unbroken chain of transmission, through a lineage that was never completely forgotten. We've arrived at the most important link in this story, the point where the lineage stops being speculation based on Sumerian texts and becomes documented European history. The Merovingians, the first royal dynasty of France, which came to power in the 5th century AD, and which from the beginning was visibly different from other royal families of the era. The sacred hair Merovingian kings never cut their hair. This wasn't fashion, it wasn't a vague cultural tradition. It was sacred. They believed their power resided in their hair. That cutting a Merovingian king's hair was literally stealing his power, his connection to the force that legitimized his reign. When the dynasty was overthrown in the 8th century by the Carolingians, the last Merovingian kings were forced to cut their hair before being sent to monasteries. A deliberate and calculated humiliation, a symbolic destruction of the lineage's power. But this belief in hair as the seat of divine power was not invented by the Merovingians. Samson, in the biblical texts, lost all his strength when his hair was cut. This wasn't metaphor. It was a literal description of how power worked for lineage carriers. The Nazirites, a sacred order in ancient Judaism, never cut their hair as a sign of divine consecration. Samson was a Nazirite. Hair as the seat of divine power is a concept that crosses cultures linked to the same lineage. And the Merovingians practiced it as if it were fundamental law, because for them, it was. The supernatural origin. Second, the Merovingians claimed an origin that medieval historians treated as regional folklore, The founding story of the dynasty tells that the queen of the Franks was visited by a being from the sea, described as half man, half fish or reptile, and that from this union was born the first Merovingian king. Modern historians dismiss this as typical regional mythology, but researchers who know the Sumerian texts immediately recognize the pattern. Enki was the lord of the waters, frequently represented as being half human, half aquatic. And the being that the Sumerians said emerged from the sea to teach humanity agriculture, writing and the arts, was described as half man, half fish. The Merovingian founding legend is not invented folklore, it is memory. A memory distorted by time but preserved in its essence. The memory of an origin that traced back not to 5th century AD France, but to much earlier. To a lineage that had come to Europe from much further away. The bees of Childeric III. And here we arrive at the most physically disturbing detail in the entire Merovingian story. In 1653, the tomb of King Childeric I was discovered in Belgium. Childeric was the father of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, considered the founder of France as a nation. And what was inside the tomb disturbed the archaeologists. Hundreds of golden bees, gold miniatures in the shape of bees, which covered Childeric's royal mantle. Why bees? In ancient Egypt, the bee was the symbol of Lower Egypt, and the pharaoh held the title of "He who belongs to the sedge and the bee." The Egyptian royal bee was not a decorative symbol, it was a dynastic identity marker. In Sumer, the bee was associated with sacred knowledge and the production of something precious and immortal. Just as honey doesn't spoil, the lineage was not supposed to deteriorate. And then, centuries after Childeric's tomb, Napoleon Bonaparte became Emperor of France in 1804. And in choosing his imperial symbols, he didn't choose the common French shield. He didn't choose Carolingian or Capetian symbols. He chose Childeric's bees. The gold miniatures found in the 5th century Merovingian tomb were reproduced on Napoleon's coronation mantle in the 19th century. Why? Because Napoleon knew, or deeply intuited, that by connecting himself symbolically to the Merovingians, he was claiming something much older than France. He was claiming the lineage. He was saying, I am not just a successful general who seized power. I carry something that legitimizes my power in a way no military victory can do alone. The apparent end. In 751 AD, the last Merovingian king was deposed. Childeric III was forced to cut his hair, the humiliating ritual the Merovingians understood as the destruction of the lineage's power. He was sent to a monastery. The dynasty was officially over. Official history stops here. But European genealogies tell a different story. The last Merovingian kings had children. Children who married into noble families. Noble families who married into other noble families. And through centuries of carefully documented marriages by the church and the royal courts of Europe, the Merovingian lineage spread. It didn't disappear, it spread. And where did it end up? That's what we're going to show you in the next episode. Because what we discovered about where this lineage went will change the way you see who governs the world today. Let's recap what you've seen today. The Sumerian King List records that kingship descended from heaven. The first rulers were not human. They were Anunnaki or first-generation hybrids with reigns of tens of thousands of years. After the flood, kingship was deliberately reinstated. The new kings carried the original lineage, diluted but preserved. The concept of Nam Lugal, the essence of kingship, was not a metaphor. It was something physical, genetic, transmissible through controlled marriages. The symbols of the lineage, the serpent, the dragon, the fleur-de-lis, the bee, crossed 5,000 years and dozens of civilizations, marking the carriers, allowing them to recognize each other. And the Merovingians, the first royal dynasty of France, were the most documented link between this ancient lineage and medieval Europe. They knew where they came from. They practiced the preservation of power with rituals that traced directly back to Sumer. And when they were overthrown, the lineage didn't die. It spread through the noble families of Europe, silently, systematically, and it reached a place you wouldn't expect. In the next episode, we're going to trace this lineage from the fall of the Merovingians to the present, and we're going to show you why 42 out of 43 American presidents descend from the same medieval royal family. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you.